Today I want to show you some general tips for animating your pixel art. If you're a beginner looking for ways to improve, or you've never animated before, this video is for you. I will show you some tips to create and improve your animations. You can use them as a step-by-step process, or you can use the tips individually, but in general you don't want to skip the previous tips. For example, tip number 3 is about how to animate sprites, but tip number 1 is about proportions. It's in that order because you want to have good proportions before you animate. You will have a lot more work if you want to change proportions after the animation is done. Tip number 1. The first thing you have to take into account is the size and level of detail of your sprites. Big sprites need more frames in the animation, otherwise it will look choppy. So start with something relatively small. How small? It depends on how much detail the character has. My approach is to start small, like 16 by 16, and increase the size if I feel it's needed to fit more details. An easy way to adjust the size of a character is to remove lines if you want to make it smaller, or duplicate lines if you want to make it bigger. This is how I got from this sprite to this. The old one had a lot of empty space, so I removed some lines and redrawn a few stuff until it got better. Tip number 2. Have proportions that highlight the character's actions. Ever notice that characters in Street Fighter have big hands and feet? This is to emphasize their main actions, punching and kicking. So if you make a warrior, give it a big weapon, so when he swings it, it reads well on the screen and the animation is satisfying. If the game is more story heavy, maybe make the head bigger so the player can see the character's facial expressions. And if the game has fast platforming, maybe put some red spinny shoes. Here's a more extreme example. In this mockup I made for a bomber-like, I skipped the body entirely, because the player should pay more attention to the screen as a whole in this kind of game, so details are less important. The character is not making actions that really need hands or feet, just dropping bombs. So I just made the character bounce around and raise some dust as it moves to make the movement more interesting. Another example is RGB Zero, a game where you swap colors. The character is very simple because the character's color is a core mechanic, so it has to be as readable as possible. Think about what you want grabbing the player's attention. Tip number 3. Onto the animation itself. Start with keyframes. Keyframes are the most basic thing you need to animate a character, the key poses. For example, when a character is walking or running, the keyframes are when the right leg is ahead, the left leg is ahead, and both legs in the middle. Just these 3 sprites are enough to give the illusion of a character walking. For an attack animation, just the attack pose can be enough. But if you want a more complete animation, you can add what fighting games call startup and recovery frames. The startup is where the character makes a move that leads to the action, and recovery is, you guessed it, after the action, when the character gets back to its idle animation. Here's a cool example where I added an anticipation frame to the jumping animation without slowing down the gameplay. This kind of thing can really improve the overall look of the game, so try to add them whenever you can. Tip number 4. After you have your keyframes done, add more sprites between the keyframes, so the animation looks smoother. The bigger the sprite is, the more frames each animation needs to keep its movement fluid. To make animating bigger sprites easier, you can break them down into smaller parts. After you broke them down, move each part to where it should be in the next frame and the next, and so on for the entire action. Once you think the movement is good enough, you can start changing the smaller details so each piece looks right. This will make the process of animating bigger sprites easier, because you can see what the animation will look like before you change the details. This is something I use a lot in Frankenghost. I moved parts first to have a good view of the movement and then edited each part. Same for this chameleon. Here the use of this technique is much more obvious, because the character movement is very stiff, like a real chameleon. In this Christmas gift I made, the parts of the character are not edited at all. It's all just the characters broken down and the pieces move separately. Tip number 5. When something is moving fast in your animation, you can add smear frames to make the movement look more fluid. To make smear frames, you just need to paint the area the object travels when going from one keyframe to the next. It's similar to how things look blurred when moving fast. A good thing about smear frames is that you usually need fewer frames to make an animation look nice. Tip number 6. Remember to consider the weight of each object when animating. You can't convey weight to the player directly, since the player is not interacting with physical objects, so you have to do it through animation, sound and gameplay. For example, if a character is moving a heavy object, it will have to put more effort into the action. The heavier the object, the slower the movement needs to be, and the character needs to act accordingly, like it's struggling more to move. So show that through its posture, facial expression and so on. Each movement should be slower at the start and the end of each motion, and faster in the middle. This is because each movement has to build momentum to get to full speed and then decrease its momentum again before coming to a stop. Otherwise, the movement will feel weightless. Not that's necessarily wrong. Sometimes you want the character to feel a little weightless, like a ninja. Just keep this in mind depending on what you want to achieve. Tip number 7. Add details. Each part of the character should react to an action. The more things you animate around the action, the better. Make the cloth and hair move with the wind and follow the character's movements. You can add particles to make the actions look even better. For example, when the character lands on the ground with high velocity, make some dust particles pop from the impact. Different materials also animate differently, so you need to take that into account to make animations more interesting and realistic. A slime enemy should be squishy and wobbly. Hair, strings and clothes should be light and flexible. We tend to think of animation as something synchronized that moves like a single unit. You move a part of an object like a box, you move the whole box instantly. This is the case for rigid objects, but it changes for flexible materials. The more flexible and soft a material is, the more time it takes for the movement to travel through the object. You can see this applied here in the bunny's ears. They wave as the character moves. This is very clear in things like ropes, where a wave slowly travels through it. But it's also true for characters. For example, if this character moves like this, it looks really stiff because everything is moving at once. Now, if I change it to something like this, it looks a lot better, since the motion is taking some time to travel from the body to the arms. These are all the tips I had for today's video. If you have trouble using any of these tips, try to look at some references. Now that you know the basic principles, it should be easier to learn how the character animations of your favorite games were made. Don't forget to start simple. Here's a prototype of one of my first Pico 8 projects. It's very simple, but it gets the job done. Try something simple like this if you never animated before, and evolve from there. That's it for today. You can join my Discord server if you want some feedback on your animations, sprites, games, music, whatever, or just to say hi. See ya!